Imagine spending thousands of dollars on an electric car charging station, only to find your entitled neighbor secretly unplugging your car at night to charge their brand new Tesla. That's exactly what happened to me, and what started as a simple property dispute turned into a wild neighborhood drama that ended with police involvement and security cameras. But let me tell you how this whole crazy situation unfolded. Before I dive into this insane story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell to stay updated with more incredible real-life stories like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. My story begins in Maple Grove, a peaceful suburban community just outside of Portland, where perfectly maintained lawns and friendly neighbors were the norm rather than the exception. I'm Mark Thompson, a 34-year-old software developer who's lived here for the past 5 years in a charming craftsman-style home that I'd fallen in love with the moment I saw it. The house itself isn't massive, a modest 3-bedroom with large windows that flood the living room with natural light every morning. But what really made it special was the sense of community. You know those neighborhoods where people actually wave to each other and bring over cookies when someone new moves in. That was Maple Grove. My home shares a long driveway with the house next door, a rental property owned by an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who live in Florida most of the year. The shared driveway arrangement had never been an issue before. In fact, it was one of those situations that actually brought neighbors closer together. The previous tenants, the Millers, were a lovely retired couple who would often invite me over for Sunday barbecues. We had an unspoken system. They'd park their sedan on the left, I'd park on the right, and we'd both keep the middle clear for easy access. Life here was predictable in the best possible way. I'd wake up early, work from my home office overlooking the front garden, and often spend evenings tending to my small vegetable patch or chatting with neighbors during their evening walks. Barbara from across the street would sometimes bring over her famous lemon squares, and old Mr. Peterson next door would share gardening tips that had been passed down through generations. The shared driveway had actually become something of a neighborhood talking point, a positive example of how two households could cooperatively share space without any drama. The Millers and I would even coordinate our maintenance efforts, splitting the cost of snow removal in winter and sharing the responsibility of keeping the concrete clean and well maintained. Everything changed when the Millers decided to move closer to their grandchildren in Arizona. I remember helping them pack their moving truck, thinking about how much I'd miss our easygoing arrangement. "Don't worry, Mark," Mrs. Miller had said, patting my arm. "I'm sure whoever moves in next will be just as considerate." If only she knew how wrong that prediction would turn out to be. The rental sat empty for about 2 months while the Hendersons had some minor renovations done. I actually helped them by keeping an eye on the contractors and making sure everything was running smoothly. They were grateful for my assistance and assured me they'd be very selective about their next tenants. "We want someone who'll be a good neighbor to you, Mark," Mr. Henderson had said during one of our phone calls. "Someone who'll maintain the property's value and respect the shared spaces." Then one sunny Saturday morning in early March, I noticed a moving truck pulling into the driveway. From my home office window, I watched as a sleek Tesla Model Y pulled in behind it, my first glimpse of Rachel Anderson and her husband Dave. The Tesla immediately caught my attention, not because I had anything against electric vehicles. I'd actually been researching getting one myself, but because of how it was parked diagonally across both sides of the shared driveway. I decided to be proactive and introduce myself, wanting to start things off on the right foot. Walking over with a friendly wave, I noticed Rachel was directing the movers with an air of authority, while Dave seemed more interested in his phone than the moving process. Rachel was probably in her mid-30s, dressed in what looked like designer athleisure wear, with the kind of perfectly maintained blonde hair that suggested regular salon visits. Dave, slightly older, had that distracted look of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Hi there," I called out, extending my hand. "I'm Mark Thompson, your neighbor. Welcome to Maple Grove." Rachel gave me a quick once-over, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Oh, hi. I'm Rachel, and that's Dave." She gestured vaguely toward her husband, who barely looked up from his phone. "We're just trying to get everything sorted here. The movers are being absolutely useless with my antique mirror." I tried to keep the conversation going, mentioning the shared driveway arrangement and how well it had worked in the past. "The Millers and I had a great system." "Oh, don't worry about that," Rachel interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "We won't be in your way. Though I hope you don't mind if we park the Tesla here for now. It's just temporary until we get everything figured out." Little did I know that this casual conversation would be the beginning of a neighborhood saga that would test my patience, challenge my principles, and ultimately teach me valuable lessons about standing up for myself. But at that moment, watching Rachel direct the movers, and Dave continued to ignore everything around him, I had no idea just how much my peaceful life in Maple Grove was about to change. And that's when things started to get interesting. But before I tell you what happened next, don't forget to smash that like button if you've ever had to deal with entitled neighbors. You won't believe what Rachel did next. The first few days after Rachel and Dave moved in, I tried to maintain my usual optimistic outlook. After all, everyone deserves a chance to settle in, right? But it didn't take long for me to notice that something was different about our new neighbors. And not in a good way. It started with the little things. You know how sometimes you get that gut feeling that something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. That's exactly how I felt watching Rachel and Dave's moving process unfold. While the Millers had been methodical and organized, Rachel seemed to approach everything with a sense of entitled chaos. Their moving boxes remained scattered across the shared driveway for days, forcing me to squeeze past them just to reach my own garage. When I politely mentioned this to Dave one morning, he just shrugged and mumbled something about Rachel handling all that stuff. It became clear pretty quickly that Dave was going to be a passive player in whatever drama was about to unfold. The Tesla, which Rachel had claimed would be temporarily parked across the driveway, hadn't moved an inch in 3 days. It sat there like some kind of modern art installation, forcing me to perform increasingly creative maneuvers just to get my car in and out. When I finally caught Rachel one evening to discuss it, her response was interesting, to say the least. "Oh, Mark," she said, rolling her eyes as if I was being unreasonable. "The Tesla needs to be parked here because it's closer to the house. You understand, right? It's an expensive car, and I need to keep an eye on it." She said this while examining her perfectly manicured nails, barely making eye contact. I tried to explain our previous parking arrangement again, even drawing a little diagram on my phone to show how we could both comfortably fit our vehicles. Rachel just smiled, that same dismissive smile I was starting to become very familiar with. "We'll figure something out," she said, before turning and walking away, her designer athleisure outfit somehow looking pristine despite the moving boxes everywhere. But the parking situation was just the beginning. Within the first week, I started noticing other changes in our once peaceful neighborhood. Rachel had apparently decided that 7 a.m. on a Saturday was the perfect time to have a landscape company and come in with their loudest equipment, not to actually landscape, mind you, just to assess the property's potential, as she loudly explained to anyone within earshot. The noise wasn't limited to daylight hours either. Dave, seemingly trying to establish some sort of presence in his own home, had taken to tinkering with his motorcycle in the driveway late into the night. The sound of his revving engine at 11 p.m. became an unwelcome addition to my evening routine. When Barbara from across the street came over to complain about the noise, Rachel dismissed her concerns with a wave of her hand. "We're just trying to make improvements to the neighborhood," she said, as if keeping everyone awake was doing us all a favor. Then came the housewarming party, though calling it a party might be an understatement. It was more like a small festival that had somehow landed in our quiet suburban street. Cars lined both sides of the road, making it nearly impossible for anyone to get through. The bass from their sound system was so intense it made my windows vibrate, and the crowd of guests spilled out onto both our driveways and lawns. I tried to be understanding. After all, everyone deserves to celebrate moving into a new home. But when I found empty wine bottles in my vegetable garden the next morning and tire tracks across my lawn, I knew I had to say something. I waited until the afternoon, giving Rachel and Dave time to clean up, which they didn't, before heading over.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Knocking on their door, I could hear Rachel's voice inside, apparently on a phone call. After several minutes of waiting, Dave finally answered, looking hungover and disheveled. "Hey, man," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "What's up?" "Dave, I wanted to talk about last night," I started, trying to keep my tone friendly but firm. "There's quite a bit of damage to my lawn, and I found bottles in my garden." "Oh yeah, sorry about that," Dave mumbled, running a hand through his messy hair. "Rachel's friends can get a bit enthusiastic, but hey, that's what lawn care is for, right?" He attempted a weak laugh. Before I could respond, Rachel appeared behind him, still on her phone. She held up one finger in the universal wait sign, though whether it was directed at me or Dave was unclear. "No, Cassandra, you absolutely cannot let them undervalue your house like that," she was saying, her voice carrying that same authoritative tone I'd heard during the move-in. "You need to be more assertive." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching as she paced back and forth behind Dave, completely ignoring my presence. Finally, after what must have been 5 minutes, she ended her call and turned to me with that same plastic smile. "Mark, is there a problem?" she asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really care what the answer might be. I explained about the lawn damage and the bottles, showing pictures I'd taken on my phone. Rachel's response was, "Well, let's just say it was memorable." "Oh, don't be such a buzzkill," she said, laughing as if I'd just told a mildly amusing joke. "It's just a lawn. Besides, your garden could use some updating anyway. Those vegetables aren't exactly adding to the neighborhood's aesthetic, you..." "No?" I stood there, momentarily stunned by her response. Was she seriously suggesting that my vegetable garden was a bigger problem than their party damage? Before I could formulate a response, she continued. "Listen, Mark," she said, her tone shifting to something almost condescending. "We're trying to bring some life to this neighborhood. It's all been a bit stale, don't you think? Change is good. And speaking of change..." She glanced at my car in the driveway. "Have you considered upgrading to something more modern? That sedan is really bringing down the property values." It was at this moment that I first noticed something that would become increasingly important in the weeks to come. A small charging cable peeking out from their garage. At the time, I didn't think much of it. After all, they had a Tesla, so of course they'd need to charge it. But looking back, I should have paid more attention to the fact that I never saw an actual charging station being installed. The next few days brought more of the same. Loud conversations at all hours. Rachel seemed to conduct all her real estate business from her front porch. More impromptu gatherings that spilled into the shared spaces, and a constant stream of delivery vehicles blocking the driveway. Dave remained largely invisible, except for his late-night motorcycle tinkering sessions. But the real turning point came about 2 weeks after they moved in. I was working from my home office when I noticed a significant number of extension cords being delivered to their house. Again, at the time, it didn't seem particularly suspicious. New homeowners often need supplies, but those extension cords would soon play a crucial role in the chaos that was about to unfold. And that's when things started to get really interesting. The extension cords were just the beginning of what would become a much bigger problem. But before I tell you what happened next, make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you've ever had to deal with neighbors who just don't understand boundaries. Trust me, you won't believe what Rachel did with those extension cords. The extension cord situation might have remained a mystery if it hadn't been for my work from home schedule. Being in my home office most days gave me a front row seat to the increasingly strange behavior next door. It started one morning when I noticed Rachel struggling with what looked like a tangled mess of extension cords in their garage. Now I consider myself a helpful neighbor. It's just how I was raised. So despite our previous interactions, I decided to offer assistance. Walking over to their garage, I called out, "Need any help with those?" Rachel's reaction was telling. She practically jumped, quickly pushing the cords behind some boxes. "Oh, Mark! No, everything's fine," she said, her voice higher than usual. "Just doing some garage organization." She then promptly closed the garage door, almost catching her designer yoga pants in the process. That same afternoon, I noticed something odd while watering my front garden. There were several extension cords snaking along the side of their house, partially hidden behind bushes. At the time, I assumed they were setting up some kind of outdoor lighting system, though it seemed like overkill for basic landscape lighting. The next few days brought more peculiar observations. Dave's late-night motorcycle tinkering had stopped, replaced by what sounded like someone moving around their garage in the early hours of the morning. I also noticed their Tesla was always parked in a slightly different position each morning, though I never actually saw them charging it. Then came the first sign that something was seriously wrong. One morning, I woke up to find my outdoor electrical outlet's cover plate slightly askew. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it had been knocked loose by the landscapers Rachel kept hiring for her endless property assessments. I fixed it and went about my day, but 3 days later, I noticed it was loose again. This time I also found scuff marks around the outlet, as if someone had been plugging and unplugging something repeatedly. Still, I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they needed to borrow power for some yard work, though a simple ask would have been nice. The situation escalated when Barbara from across the street stopped by one evening. She was bringing over her famous lemon squares, but she also had some concerns to share. "Mark," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "have you noticed anything strange happening at night? My motion sensor lights keep going off around 2 a.m., and I could swear I see someone moving around with extension cords." I invited Barbara in for coffee, and we compared notes. She mentioned that her grandson, who was staying with her for the weekend, had seen Rachel unplugging something from an outdoor outlet in the early hours of the morning. When he'd asked her about it the next day, she'd dismissed it as checking the holiday light timer. "In April," Barbara asked, raising an eyebrow, "and since when do holiday lights need industrial-grade extension cords?" The conversation with Barbara opened my eyes to other small changes in the neighborhood. Mr. Peterson, my other next-door neighbor, mentioned that his electric bill had mysteriously increased over the past month. He lived alone and hadn't changed his habits, so the spike in usage was puzzling. I started paying more attention to the patterns. The Tesla would disappear during the day, returning in the evening with what looked like very low battery levels. The kind of depletion you'd expect from a long commute. But instead of using their own charging setup, if they had one, there was always suspicious activity around the neighborhood's external outlets at night. One particular incident really set off alarm bells. I was up late one night finishing a work project when I heard a subtle scratching sound outside my window. Peering through the blinds, I caught a glimpse of someone, it looked like Dave, quickly retreating from my outdoor outlet, carrying what appeared to be an extension cord. The next morning, I decided to document everything. I checked my outdoor outlet again and found it had been tampered with. The cover was completely loose this time, and there were clear signs of regular use. I took photos of the damage and started a detailed log of all the suspicious activity I'd observed. That same day, I ran into Dave while getting my mail. Deciding to be direct, I asked, "Hey Dave, have you guys had any issues with your Tesla's charging setup?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. No. Yes. He fumbled with his words, looking everywhere, but at me. "Rachel handles all that stuff. You know how it is with these electric cars. Lots of, maintenance." He quickly retreated inside, nearly tripping over one of their many extension cords in the process. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when Rachel started hosting what she called environmental awareness meetings in their backyard. These gatherings consisted of her showing off the Tesla to the neighborhood while preaching about the importance of going green. "We all need to do our part for the environment," she announced to a group of neighbors one Saturday afternoon. "That's why we chose to go electric. It's really not that expensive when you manage your resources properly." The irony of her statement would have been funny if it wasn't so frustrating. During one of these meetings, I overheard her talking to Mrs. Thompson from 2 doors down. "The best part is how economical it is," Rachel was saying. "Our electricity bills are surprisingly low for an electric car." I had to bite my tongue to keep from pointing out why that might be the case. The final straw came when I received my own electricity bill for the month. It was nearly double my usual amount, despite my careful energy usage. Looking at the daily consumption graph, there were clear spikes in power usage between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., exactly when Barbara's motion sensors had been detecting activity. I decided to set up a small security camera near my outdoor outlet, disguised as a new planter. I wasn't trying to catch them in the act necessarily, but I needed evidence if things continued to escalate. Little did I know just how handy that footage would become. But before I show you what that security camera captured, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. You won't want to miss what happened when I finally confronted Rachel with the evidence. And trust me, her reaction was priceless. While dealing with Rachel and Dave's suspicious activities, I had been doing extensive research of my own. For months, I'd been planning to join the electric vehicle revolution the right way. Unlike some people, I believed in doing things properly and legally. My journey toward getting an electric car started long before Rachel and Dave's shenanigans. I'd been saving up, comparing different models, and calculating the total cost of ownership, including proper charging installation. This wasn't just about buying a car. It was about making a responsible investment in both my future and the environment. After careful consideration, I decided on a Hyundai Ioniq 5. It wasn't as flashy as Rachel's Tesla, but it had everything I needed: excellent range, fast charging capabilities, and strong safety ratings. Plus, there was something satisfying about choosing a car based on merit rather than status. I spent weeks comparing prices, negotiating with dealers, and finally found the perfect one in a beautiful deep blue color. The day I brought my new car home was supposed to be a celebration. I'd arranged for a certified electrician, Mike Sullivan, to come out the following week to install a proper level 2 charging station. Mike had an excellent reputation in our area and had done several installations in neighboring communities. "You're doing this the right way," Mike said during our initial consultation. "You wouldn't believe how many people try to cut corners with these installations." He walked me through the entire process, explaining how we'd need to upgrade my electrical panel to handle the additional load and install a dedicated 240-volt circuit. The installation quote came in at $2,200, Not cheap, but as Mike explained, this was an investment in both safety and convenience. This isn't something you want to skimp on, he warned. Improper charging setups can damage your car's battery, or worse, create fire hazards. I scheduled the installation for the following Tuesday, taking a day off work to oversee the process. The night before, I carefully cleared out the garage area where the charging station would go. As I was organizing, I noticed more extension cords snaking along the property line between our houses. The irony wasn't lost on me. The installation day arrived, and Mike and his team showed up bright and early. They were professional, efficient, and thorough. Everything you'd want in an electrical contractor. As they worked, Rachel kept finding reasons to walk by, peering curiously at the installation process. Around mid-morning, she finally approached me while Mike was upgrading the electrical panel. "So you got an electric car too?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but clearly interested in what was happening. "You know, you could have asked to use our charging setup." I had to bite my tongue to keep from pointing out that they didn't seem to have a proper setup of their own. Instead, I politely explained that I preferred having my own dedicated charging station. "It's safer and more reliable," I added, hoping she might take the hint. Rachel just smiled that dismissive smile of hers and walked away, though I noticed her watching the installation process from her kitchen window. The entire installation took about 6 hours. Mike and his team ran new wiring, installed the charging station, and thoroughly tested everything. They even helped me set up the smartphone app that would let me monitor my charging sessions and energy usage, a feature that would prove incredibly useful later on. "Everything's up to code," Mike assured me, showing me the final inspection checklist. "You've got a 40-amp circuit dedicated to the charger, GFCI protection, and proper grounding. This is how it should be done." He walked me through the basics of using the charging station and gave me his card in case I had any questions. The total cost, including the charging station, installation, permits, and electrical upgrades, came to $2,175. It was a significant investment, but knowing it was done properly gave me peace of mind. Plus, I calculated that between fuel savings and available tax incentives, the system would pay for itself within a few years. That evening, I was in my garage admiring the new setup when Dave wandered over. He seemed unusually interested in the installation, asking detailed questions about the cost and process. "Man, that's really professional," he said, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "Rachel's been talking about getting something like this installed, but..." He trailed off, glancing back at their house. I seized the opportunity to offer some friendly advice. "Mike does great work," I said, handing him Mike's business card. "He could probably help you set up a proper charging station too." Dave took the card but quickly stuffed it in his pocket when we heard Rachel calling him from their porch. The next few days were wonderful. Having a proper charging setup made owning an electric car so much more convenient. No more worrying about finding public charging stations or planning my day around charging stops. I could plug in at night and wake up to a fully charged battery every morning. I also noticed something interesting. Rachel and Dave's late-night activities seemed to have temporarily ceased. Perhaps seeing a proper charging station installation had made them reconsider their approach. But I should have known better than to get my hopes up. About a week after my charging station was installed, I was working late in my home office when I heard a familiar sound outside. Through my window, I could see Rachel approaching my garage, extension cord in hand. She was looking around furtively, clearly not expecting anyone to be awake at this hour. I watched in disbelief as she tried to access my new charging station. The audacity was stunning after seeing me invest in a proper setup after all. The work and money spent doing things the right way, she was still trying to steal electricity. What happened next completely changed the dynamic between us. But before I tell you how I handled this situation, make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you believe in doing things the right way, even if it costs more. And trust me, you won't want to miss Rachel's reaction when I caught her in the act. Remember that security camera I had set up disguised as a planter? Well, it was about to prove its worth. After catching a glimpse of Rachel attempting to access my charging station that night, I decided to review the footage from the past few days. What I found made my blood boil. The camera had captured crystal-clear footage of Rachel and Dave's nighttime operations. At exactly 2:17 a.m. the previous night, Rachel had approached my garage with not just one extension cord, but an entire daisy-chained setup. She had tried to plug into my charging station, but thankfully, the security features I'd had installed prevented unauthorized access. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean infuriating. The footage showed Rachel returning at 3:45 a.m., this time with Dave in tow. While she kept watch, Dave actually attempted to override the charging station's safety protocols. They spent nearly 20 minutes trying to hack my charging station before giving up and retreating to their house. I sat in my home office, watching the footage over and over, feeling a mix of emotions, anger, disbelief, and honestly, a bit of satisfaction at having caught them red-handed. But I wanted to handle this professionally. After all, I had invested in doing things the right way. I wasn't about to stoop to their level now. The next morning, I decided to confront them with evidence in hand. I waited until I saw both their cars in the driveway, no more sneaking around in the dark. As I walked over to their front door, I could hear Rachel on another one of her business calls through the open window. I knocked firmly on their door. After a few moments, Dave answered, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. His expression changed from disinterest to concern when he saw my face. "Dave," I said calmly, "we need to talk. Is Rachel available? This concerns both of you." Rachel appeared behind Dave, still on her phone. "I'll call you back, Cassandra," she said, ending her call. "Mark, what's so urgent that you need to interrupt my work calls?" I held up my tablet. "I think we need to discuss what's been happening with my charging station. Would you like to explain why you were trying to access it at 3 a.m.? The color drained from Dave's face, but Rachel barely missed a beat. "Oh, that?" she said with a dismissive wave. "We were just checking to see if our charging adapter would be compatible, you know, in case of emergencies." "At 3 in the morning?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "And what about the attempt to override the security features?" Dave shifted uncomfortably, but Rachel's demeanor turned defensive. "Look, Mark," she said, crossing her arms, "you're being ridiculous. We have every right to access charging facilities in our neighborhood. It's a shared community resource." I took a deep breath. "No, Rachel, it's not. This charging station was installed at my expense. It's connected to my electrical system, and I'm paying for every kilowatt hour it uses. What you're attempting is theft, plain and simple." "Theft?" Rachel laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Don't be so dramatic. It's just a little electricity. Besides, your charger is clearly visible from the shared driveway, which makes it a community amenity." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's not how this works," I explained, trying to maintain my composure. "The charging station cost me nearly $3,000 to install properly. It's my private property, connected to my electrical panel, and attempting to use it without permission is theft of services." Rachel's face hardened. "Well, if you're going to be so selfish about it, maybe we need to discuss your use of the shared driveway. I've noticed your car takes up quite a bit of space." "The driveway arrangement has nothing to do with my private electrical equipment," I countered. "I have security footage of multiple attempts to access my charging station without permission. I'm telling you now, officially and on record, to stop trying to use my charging station. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." Dave finally spoke up, his voice quiet. "Rachel, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Dave," Rachel snapped. She turned back to me, her fake smile replaced with a cold stare. "Are you threatening us, Mark? Because I don't respond well to threats." "It's not a threat," I replied calmly. "It's a statement of fact. I have documented evidence of attempted theft, and I'm formally requesting that you stop. What happens next is entirely up to you." I showed them the clearest footage from my security camera, including timestamps, and their failed attempt to override the system. Dave looked increasingly uncomfortable, but Rachel's expression remained defiant. "You know what your problem is, Mark," Rachel said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're not a team player. This is exactly why this neighborhood was so boring before we moved in. People like you, so caught up in their little rules and boundaries." I stood my ground. "This isn't about being a team player, Rachel. This is about respecting private property and following proper procedures. If you need a charging station, I'm happy to give you Mike's contact information again. He can install one properly, just like he did for me." "We don't need your contractor recommendations," Rachel scoffed. "And we certainly don't need your permission to use available resources in our own neighborhood. Actually, you do need my permission to use my private charging station," I corrected her. "And since you seem confused about this, let me be very clear. You do not have my permission. Any further attempts to access my charging station will be reported as attempted theft." Rachel's face flushed with anger. "We'll see about that," she said, before slamming the door in my face. As I walked back to my house, I could hear Rachel and Dave arguing through their open windows. Dave seemed to be suggesting they look into getting their own charging station installed, but Rachel's responses were too muffled to make out clearly. That evening, I sent them a formal email documenting our conversation and reiterating that they did not have permission to use my charging station. I attached screenshots from the security footage and copied the property management company that handled their rental. I wanted a clear paper trail of everything that had happened. I also decided to take additional security measures. I installed more cameras with better lighting and motion sensors. I wasn't trying to escalate the situation, but I needed to protect my investment and my property rights. But if you think this confrontation would put an end to Rachel's entitled behavior, you're in for a surprise. What she did next took things to a whole new level. Hit that subscribe button and get ready for the next part of this crazy story. The day after our confrontation, I decided to take a more diplomatic approach. Maybe, I thought, there was still a way to resolve this situation amicably. I spent my morning putting together a comprehensive information packet about EV charging installation, including Mike's business card, local rebate programs, and even some financing options that could make the installation more affordable. I also reached out to Barbara and Mr. Peterson, asking if they'd had any similar issues with their outdoor outlets since our last conversation. Barbara confirmed that her motion sensors hadn't been triggered recently, but her electricity bill was still unusually high. Mr. Peterson mentioned that he'd actually installed locks on his outdoor outlets after our previous discussion. Around noon, I saw Dave outside, washing their Tesla. He was alone, a rare sight, and seemed more relaxed without Rachel's presence. I decided this might be my opportunity for a reasonable conversation. "Hey, Dave," I called out, walking over with the information packet. "Got a minute?" He glanced nervously toward their house before responding. Yeah, I guess. Just don't tell Rachel I was talking to you." I handed him the packet. "Look, I know things got heated yesterday, but I really want to help you guys do this the right way. I did some research, and there are some great programs that could help with the installation costs." Dave looked through the materials, genuinely interested. This is actually really helpful," he admitted. "I've been trying to tell Rachel we need our own charging setup, but she keeps saying it's a waste of money when there are perfectly good outlets in the neighborhood. The thing is, Dave, I explained, using extension cords and regular outlets isn't just about the cost. It's dangerous. You could damage your car's battery, or worse, create a fire hazard. He nodded, looking increasingly uncomfortable. I know, I've actually been reading about that online. But Rachel, he lowered his voice. She thinks rules are just suggestions, you know? Always has, probably always will. Our conversation was cut short by the sound of Rachel's car pulling into the driveway. Dave quickly stuffed the packet into his pocket and resumed washing the Tesla, pretending we hadn't been talking. Rachel stepped out of her car, designer sunglasses in place, taking in the scene before her. "Well, isn't this cozy?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Dave, honey, are you making friends with our electricity police?" I decided to try one more time for a peaceful resolution. "Rachel, I was just sharing some information about proper charging station installation. There are some really good rebate programs available right now." "Oh, save it," she interrupted, walking past me toward their front door. "Dave, when you're done playing nice with the neighbors, we need to talk about your complete lack of backbone." I watched as Dave's shoulders slumped. He gave me an apologetic look before gathering up his car washing supplies and heading inside. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the property management company. They had reviewed my documentation of the charging station incidents and assured me they would address the issue with their tenants. They also mentioned that unauthorized modifications to the property's electrical system would be a violation of the rental agreement. I felt a small sense of relief. At least the property managers were taking this seriously, but that relief was short-lived. Around 8 p.m., I heard a commotion outside. Looking through my window, I saw Rachel engaged in what appeared to be a heated phone conversation while pacing in their driveway. "No, you listen," she was saying loudly enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "I don't care what the property management company says. We have rights as tenants, and if that stuck-up neighbor thinks he can dictate how we live, he's got another thing coming." She continued her tirade, now clearly performing for an audience she knew was listening. "It's ecological discrimination. That's what it is. He's trying to prevent us from using green technology. I should report him to the Environmental Protection Agency." I couldn't help but marvel at her mental gymnastics. Somehow, in her mind, I had become the villain for protecting my own property and encouraging safe, legal charging practices. The next morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was from Rachel and Dave's lawyer, or at least that's what the letterhead claimed. The letter suggested that my harassment and discrimination against their eco-friendly lifestyle choices could result in legal action if I didn't cease and desist. I had to read it twice to believe what I was seeing. The letter was poorly written and full of vague threats, leading me to suspect Rachel had either written it herself or found the cheapest possible lawyer to draft it. I decided to consult with my own lawyer, sending her all the documentation I had gathered, the security footage, emails, photos of the extension cord setups, and now this threatening letter. Her response was reassuring. "This is a clear case of attempted theft of services," she explained during our phone consultation. "Their letter has no legal merit and, if anything, helps document their pattern of harassment. Keep maintaining your records, and we can file for a restraining order if needed." Taking my lawyer's advice, I continued documenting everything. I installed additional security cameras, making sure to cover all angles of my property. I also started keeping a detailed log of every interaction, no matter how small. That evening, I was surprised by a knock at my door. It was Dave, looking nervous as usual. "I'm sorry about the lawyer letter," he said quietly. "Rachel, she found some template online and modified it. I told her it was a bad idea, but you know how she gets." I appreciated his honesty, but kept my guard up. "Dave, I understand you're in a difficult position, but this has to stop. The proper installation of a charging station isn't that complicated or expensive, especially with the current rebate programs. He nodded, glancing back at his house. I know. I've been looking at the information you gave me. Maybe if I can convince Rachel that it's about property values or status or something. She responds to that kind of thing. Before we could continue our conversation, Rachel's voice rang out from their porch. Dave, what did I tell you about fraternizing? With the enemy? Dave quickly retreated, leaving me standing in my doorway. I could hear their argument continue inside their house, with Rachel's voice rising above Dave's attempts to reason with her. But just when I thought things couldn't get more ridiculous, Rachel came up with a scheme that would take this conflict to a whole new level. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because what happened next will absolutely blow your mind. Remember how I mentioned Rachel might come up with an even more outrageous scheme? Well, she didn't disappoint. The weekend after the lawyer letter fiasco, I woke up to find my entire charging station wrapped in yellow caution tape with a makeshift sign attached to it reading, "Notice, Community Charging Station, schedule your time slot with HOA." The problem? Our neighborhood didn't even have an HOA. I stood there in my driveway, coffee cup in hand, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. That's when Barbara came power walking by, stopping dead in her tracks when she saw the spectacle. "Oh my word," she gasped, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "Mark, did you see what Rachel posted in the neighborhood Facebook group?" I hadn't. I pulled out my phone and checked the group. There it was. A long post from Rachel, complete with photos of my charging station, claiming that she had been elected as the head of a new green energy initiative for our neighborhood. According to her post, all charging stations in the area were to be considered community property in the interest of environmental justice. The comment section was chaos. Most neighbors were confused, some were angry, and a few were actually supporting Rachel's ridiculous claims. She had somehow managed to turn my private property into a neighborhood controversy, but Rachel wasn't done yet. As I was reading through the comments, I heard the distinctive sound of her Tesla pulling into the driveway. She stepped out, wearing what looked like a homemade environmental committee badge, followed by Dave carrying a clipboard. "Good morning, Mark," she called out with fake cheerfulness. "I see you've noticed our new community initiative. We'll need you to sign some paperwork authorizing the sharing program." I took a deep breath. "Rachel, remove the tape and signs from my property, now." "Actually," she replied, consulting her clipboard with an air of authority, "according to the new neighborhood guidelines." "Guidelines that you made up," I interrupted. "This is private property, Rachel. There is no HOA, no environmental committee, and absolutely no sharing program. Remove the tape, or I'm calling the police." She smiled, that condescending smile I'd grown to detest. "I was hoping you'd be more community-minded, Mark. Dave, take notes. We may need to document this resistance to green initiatives." Dave looked like he wanted to sink into the ground. "Rachel, maybe we should take the notes." "Dave." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Rachel, this is your final warning. Remove everything you've placed on my property, or I'm calling the police and filing a harassment report." "Go ahead," she challenged. "I'm sure the local news would love to hear about the man who's preventing his neighborhood from going green." I can see the headlines now. "Local resident hoards clean energy resources." That's when Mr. Peterson, who had been watching from his driveway, decided to intervene. "Rachel, I've been living in this neighborhood for 30 years, and I've never seen such ridiculous behavior. Mark paid for that charging station himself. It's his property." Rachel spun around to face him. "Mr. Peterson, with all due respect, you don't understand the importance of shared resources in today's environmental crisis. This is bigger than property rights." "What I understand," Mr. Peterson replied calmly, "is that you're trying to steal from your neighbor while pretending it's for the greater good." More neighbors had gathered now, attracted by the commotion. Barbara was still recording everything on her phone, and someone had already called the non-emergency police line. Rachel, realizing she was losing her audience, decided to change tactics. "Fine, if you want to be selfish about this, Mark, let's talk about your carbon footprint. Did you know that your charging station is probably powered by coal? My Tesla runs on pure environmental consciousness." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. "Rachel, your Tesla runs on electricity that you've been trying to steal from everyone in the neighborhood. How is that environmentally conscious?" "It's not stealing if it's for a good cause," she argued, her voice rising. "You're just too narrow-minded to see the bigger picture. Dave, show them the petition." Dave reluctantly pulled out a stack of papers. We got 3 signatures." 3 signatures. Rachel snatched the papers from him. "This is unacceptable. The whole neighborhood should be supporting this." "Supporting what exactly?" I asked. "Your attempt to take over my private property, your unauthorized environmental committee, or your continued attempts to steal electricity." That's when Rachel made her fatal mistake. In her frustration, she stormed over to my charging station and started trying to rip down the caution tape, the same tape she had put up. In the process, she managed to damage one of the charging station's protective covers. I immediately documented the damage with my phone. "That's destruction of private property, Rachel, and I have it on video." 2 police cars pulled up at that moment, and Rachel's face went through a fascinating range of emotions, from anger to panic to what she probably thought was righteous indignation. Officer Martinez, who had dealt with our previous complaints, stepped out of his car and surveyed the scene. The yellow tape, the gathered neighbors, Rachel's homemade badge, and Dave still clutching his clipboard. It must have been quite a sight. "Ms. Anderson," Officer Martinez sighed, "we meet again. But before I tell you how Officer Martinez handled this situation, smash that like button if you've ever dealt with someone who tried to disguise their entitled behavior as activism. And trust me, Rachel's reaction to the police showing up is something you won't want to miss." Officer Martinez had barely stepped out of his patrol car when Rachel launched into her performance of a lifetime. "Officer, I'm so glad you're here," she began, straightening her homemade badge. "I need to report a serious case of environmental discrimination. This man," she pointed at me dramatically, "is refusing to share critical green infrastructure with the community." Officer Martinez, to his credit, maintained his professional demeanor. "Ms. Anderson, I see you've added some decorations to Mr. Thompson's charging station." "Those are official notices," Rachel insisted. "As the head of the Neighborhood Environmental Committee," "A committee that doesn't exist," Barbara interjected, still recording everything on her phone. Officer Martinez held up his hand. "Let's start from the beginning. Mr. Thompson, could you explain what's happening here?" I walked Officer Martinez through the situation, showing him the damage Rachel had just caused to the charging station, the fake notices she'd posted, and the security footage from my cameras. I also pulled up her Facebook post about the non-existent HOA and Green Energy Initiative. Additionally, I added, I have documentation of multiple attempts to access my charging station without permission, including attempts to override the security features. Officer Martinez turned to his partner, Officer Rodriguez, who had been taking notes. Ms. Anderson, removing those notices and the caution tape would be a good start. I will not, Rachel declared, crossing her arms. This is a matter of principle. The community has rights. The community has laws, Officer Martinez corrected her. And right now, you're violating several of them. vandalism, attempted theft of services, harassment. Dave, who had been trying to make himself invisible behind his clipboard, finally spoke up. "Rachel, maybe we should just take down the signs." "Shut up, Dave! I'm handling this!" Rachel snapped before turning back to the officers. "This is clearly a conspiracy against progressive environmental policies. I demand to speak to your supervisor." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "Ma'am, you can certainly file a complaint, but right now you need to remove everything you've placed on Mr. Thompson's property. This is private property, and you have no authority to declare it a community resource." "But what about the environment?" Rachel protested. "What about our carbon footprint? Someone needs to take a stand." "Taking a stand doesn't mean taking someone else's property," Officer Martinez said firmly. "Now you have two options. Remove the tape and signs voluntarily, or we can add more charges to the report." Rachel looked around at the gathered neighbors, apparently hoping for support, but found none. Even her usual supporters from the Facebook group were shaking their heads. "Fine," she exclaimed, dramatically ripping down the caution tape. "But this isn't over. The community will hear about this suppression of environmental activism." Datus, as Rachel and a very uncomfortable-looking Dave removed their official notices, Officer Martinez pulled me aside. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, "given the escalating nature of these incidents, I strongly recommend you file for a restraining order. We have enough documentation here to support that." I nodded, already thinking about contacting my lawyer. "What about the damage to the charging station?" "We'll document everything," he assured me. "I'm also going to recommend that the property management company review their lease agreement. This kind of behavior usually violates standard rental terms." While the officers were photographing the damage and taking statements from witnesses, Rachel couldn't help but continue her performance. "This is exactly what's wrong with society," she announced to anyone who would listen. "People claiming ownership of resources that should belong to everyone. In Europe, they share everything." "Actually," Mr. Peterson called out, "I just got back from visiting my daughter in Germany. Their charging stations are even more regulated than ours." Rachel shot him a venomous look before storming back to her house, dragging Dave behind her. Officer Martinez finished taking statements and turned to address the gathered neighbors. "Folks, I know there's been some confusion about community resources and environmental initiatives. Let me be clear, private property is private property. No self-appointed committee can change that." Barbara, who had finally stopped recording, spoke up. "Officer, what should we do if she tries something like this again?" "Document everything and call us immediately," he replied. "And I'd recommend everyone check their outdoor electrical outlets and consider installing security cameras." After the police left and the neighbors dispersed, I stayed outside to fully document the damage to my charging station. The protective cover would need to be replaced, and there were several scratches from Rachel's attempt to remove her own caution tape. As I was taking photos, I heard Rachel's voice floating out from their open window. "This is discrimination! We should sue the entire neighborhood! Dave, get me the phone number for that lawyer we saw on the bus bench!" Dave's response was too quiet to hear, but it was followed by the sound of a door slamming and Rachel's continued ranting about environmental justice and community rights. I went inside and immediately emailed everything to my lawyer, the new photos, videos from multiple neighbors, and the police report number. She responded quickly, suggesting we move forward with the restraining order and possibly a civil suit for the damage. Later that evening, I received an unexpected email from the Hendersons, Rachel and Dave's landlords. They had been updated about the situation and were deeply concerned about their tenants' behavior. They asked for copies of all my documentation and assured me they would take appropriate action. I was in the middle of responding to their email when I heard a commotion outside. Looking through my security cameras, I saw Rachel placing what appeared to be flyers on everyone's doorstep. I zoomed in on one that had fallen on the sidewalk. It was an announcement for an emergency community meeting about ecological resource sharing to be held in her backyard the next day. But Rachel's attempt to rally the neighborhood against me would backfire in the most spectacular way. Hit subscribe and the notification bell to make sure you don't miss what happened at her emergency community meeting. And trust me, you won't believe who showed up. The morning of Rachel's emergency community meeting arrived, and I woke up to find my inbox flooded with messages from neighbors. Everyone had received her flyer, and most were reaching out to express their concern about her escalating behavior. But it was an email from the Hendersons that really caught my attention. "We're flying in tomorrow," they wrote. "This situation requires our personal intervention." I hadn't expected the landlords to take such immediate action, but I was relieved they were taking it seriously. In the meantime, I had my own plans to implement. After consulting with my lawyer the previous evening, we had developed a comprehensive strategy to protect both my property and my rights. The first step was already in motion. A formal cease and desist letter had been sent to Rachel and Dave via certified mail. The second step would require some significant changes to my property, but given recent events, it seemed necessary. I called Mike, the electrician who had installed my charging station, and explained the situation. He wasn't surprised. "You wouldn't believe how many similar cases I've seen," he said. "Though I have to admit, the fake environmental committee is a new one. I can be there in an hour to assess what needs to be done." True to his word, Mike arrived promptly, tool belt at the ready. As he examined the damage Rachel had caused, he shook his head. The good news is, the internal components weren't affected. The bad news is, we need to completely redesign the security setup. We discussed various options, and Mike proposed a comprehensive solution, moving the entire charging station into my garage and installing a secure access system. It wouldn't be cheap. The estimate came to $3,400 for the relocation, new security features, and additional electrical work, but it would permanently solve the access problem. We can add motion-activated lights, security cameras specifically for the charging area, and a reinforced garage door, Mike explained. Plus, the new location will actually be more convenient for you. I agreed to the work, and Mike said he could have his team there the next morning. As we finished up the paperwork, I noticed Rachel's backyard was being set up for her emergency meeting. She had arranged folding chairs in rows and was setting up what appeared to be a presentation board. Throughout the day, I documented everything, taking photos of the charging station damage, recording my conversation with Mike, and saving all communication with neighbors and the Hendersons. My lawyer had emphasized the importance of maintaining a detailed record of events. Around 4 p.m., Rachel's emergency community meeting was scheduled to begin. From my home office window, I could see neighbors arriving, though not nearly as many as Rachel had probably hoped for. Barbara was there with her phone ready to record. Mr. Peterson sat in the back row looking amused, and a few other neighbors scattered themselves throughout the chairs. Rachel stood at the front, wearing her homemade environmental committee badge and a new addition, what appeared to be a green sash with Community Resource Director written on it in glitter paint. Dave sat off to the side, still clutching his clipboard and looking increasingly uncomfortable. Just as Rachel was about to begin her presentation, a car pulled into their driveway. 2 people stepped out, a man in a business suit and a woman, carrying a leather portfolio. The man spoke first. "Ms. Anderson, I'm Jeffrey Williams from the Property Management Company, and this is Sarah Chen from our legal department." Rachel's face went through several interesting expressions before settling on what she probably thought was professional composure. "Oh, you're here for the meeting. We're discussing some exciting new community initiatives. No, Ms. Anderson, Mr. Williams interrupted. We're here because you violated multiple terms of your lease agreement. We need to discuss this immediately. But my meeting, Rachel protested. Your unauthorized meeting about redistributing private property can wait, Ms. Chen said firmly. Inside, please. The gathered neighbors watched as Rachel, still wearing her glitter-painted sash, was escorted into her house along with a very relieved-looking Dave. Through the open windows, we could hear Rachel's voice rising in protest, followed by the calmer tones of the property managers. Taking advantage of this interruption, I decided to implement the next phase of my plan. I had already scheduled security system installers to arrive the next morning, along with Mike's team. I spent the evening preparing my garage for the charging station relocation, clearing space and organizing things to make the work as efficient as possible. Around 7 p.m., Dave knocked on my door. He looked exhausted. Mark, he said, running a hand through his hair, I wanted to let you know. We got a formal warning from the property managers. One more incident and we're facing eviction. He paused, glancing back at his house. Rachel's not taking it well. I could hear Rachel's voice from their open windows, apparently now on the phone with someone. They can't do this to me. I have rights. Get me a real lawyer, not those bus bench hacks. Dave turned back to me. I also wanted to say, I'm sorry. I should have stopped this sooner. It's just when Rachel gets an idea in her head. I appreciated his apology but maintained my guard. Dave, I understand you're in a difficult position, but this has gone beyond uncomfortable neighbor relations. I've invested thousands of dollars in proper equipment, followed all the rules, and still had to deal with attempted theft and vandalism. He nodded, looking at his feet. I know. I've been trying to tell her we should just get our own charging station installed, but she says it's giving in to the oppressors or something. He sighed. The property managers left us some information about approved charging station installers. Maybe now she'll listen. As if on cue, Rachel's voice carried across the driveway. Dave, are you fraternizing with the enemy again? Get back here. We need to plan our legal strategy. Dave's shoulders slumped. I better go. But just so you know, I've been documenting everything too, if it comes to legal action. He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear. He was preparing for the possibility of testifying against his own wife. The next morning would bring even more surprises as the Hendersons arrived to find their property had become ground zero for a neighborhood dispute. Make sure you're subscribed to find out what happened when Rachel had to face her actual landlords in person. And trust me, her reaction was priceless. The next morning started early with the arrival of Mike's team and the security installers. I'd barely finished my first cup of coffee when Rachel emerged from her house, still in her designer pajamas, to investigate the activity in my garage. What's all this? She demanded, hands on her hips. More attempts to hoard community resources. Before I could respond, a sleek BMW pulled into the driveway. The Hendersons had arrived, and they did not look happy. Mr. Henderson, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, stepped out first, followed by Mrs. Henderson, who was already shaking her head at the community resource director sash Rachel was still wearing from yesterday. Ms. Anderson, Mr. Henderson called out, his voice carrying the weight of decades in property management. I see you're already up. Good. We have much to discuss. Rachel's demeanor shifted instantly. Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, I'm so glad you're here. I've been trying to implement some wonderful community initiatives, like attempting to steal electricity and damaging private property. Mrs. Henderson interrupted, consulting a tablet. Or perhaps you'd like to explain this environmental committee you've invented. Rachel's face flushed. That's a complete misrepresentation. I'm simply trying to promote green energy solutions for the neighborhood. If anything, you should be thanking me for increasing property values through environmental leadership." Mr. Henderson held up his hand. "Ms. Anderson, we've received numerous complaints, photo evidence, security camera footage, and police reports. Your actions have put us in a very difficult position." "But," Rachel started. "Inside," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Now!" As Rachel was led into her house, Dave emerged, looking like he hadn't slept. He gave me a quick nod before following the others inside. Through the open windows, the conversation was clearly audible. "This lease violation is serious," Mr. Henderson's voice carried out. "Attempting to commandeer private property, unauthorized modifications to electrical systems, harassment of neighbors." Rachel's voice rose in protest. "It's not harassment, it's environmental activism. You can't punish people for trying to save the planet." "We can and will take action when tenants violate their lease agreement," Mrs. Henderson replied. "The terms are very clear about respecting private property and unauthorized electrical modifications." The conversation continued as Mike's team worked on relocating my charging station. The new security setup was impressive. Reinforced access points, dedicated cameras, and a sophisticated authentication system. It wasn't cheap, but given recent events, it seemed necessary. Around noon, Rachel stormed out of her house, followed by a weary-looking Dave and the Hendersons. She marched straight up to where Mike was installing the new security features. "This is it," she declared, pointing dramatically at the construction. "This is exactly the kind of anti-environmental fortress mentality that's destroying our planet. Mr. Henderson, surely you can see how this goes against community interests." Mr. Henderson looked unimpressed. "Ms. Anderson, the only thing I see is a property owner protecting his investment from theft and vandalism." "It's not theft," Rachel insisted, her voice rising. "It's resource redistribution in a just society." "In a just society," Mrs. Henderson cut in. "People respect property rights and follow proper procedures. Speaking of which, we noticed some concerning modifications to our property's electrical system. Care to explain those?" Rachel's face went pale. During their inspection, the Hendersons must have discovered her makeshift charging setup. "Those are temporary improvements for energy efficiency. Those are unauthorized modifications that violate both your lease and local building codes," Mr. Henderson stated. "They'll need to be removed immediately." "But how am I supposed to charge my car?" Rachel demanded. "The same way everyone else does," Mrs. Henderson replied. "By installing a proper charging station through approved contractors. We've already provided you with a list of certified installers." Rachel's expression shifted to something between desperation and defiance. "Fine. Then I'll sue. I'll sue everyone. This is discrimination against environmental advocates. I'll go to the media. Local homeowners suppress green energy initiative." How will that look in the headlines? Mr. Henderson remained calm. "Ms. Anderson, you have two choices. One, you can comply with your lease terms, remove the unauthorized modifications, and have a proper charging station installed through approved channels. Two, you can continue this behavior and face eviction. Your choice." "Eviction?" Rachel's voice reached a new pitch. "You can't evict us. We have rights. Dave, call that lawyer from the bus bench again." Dave, who had been trying to blend into the background, spoke up. "Actually, Rachel, I've been looking at the lease agreement. They can evict us. Maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Dave. You never understand the bigger picture." Rachel turned back to the Hendersons. "This isn't over. I'll call every environmental organization in the state. I'll contact the EPA, the Department of Energy, the United Nations." "You do that," Mrs. Henderson said dryly. In the meantime, you have 48 hours to remove all unauthorized electrical modifications. We'll be conducting an inspection on Wednesday." Rachel stormed back into the house, slamming the door so hard that her community resource director sash fell from where it had been hanging. Dave picked it up, looked at it for a moment, then quietly folded it and put it in his pocket before following her inside. The Hendersons turned to me. "Mr. Thompson, we sincerely apologize for this situation. We'll be taking appropriate action to ensure it doesn't continue." I appreciated their professionalism, but I had one concern. "What? About the damage to my charging station?" "We'll cover the repair costs," Mr. Henderson assured me. "And we're adding specific language about charging station access to all our lease agreements to prevent future incidents." But if you think this was the end of Rachel's crusade, you're in for a surprise. Her next move would be so outrageous that even Dave couldn't stand by quietly anymore. Hit that subscribe button and get ready for what happened next. After the Hendersons left, I thought we might finally see some positive changes. The new security system was being installed, my charging station was safely relocated inside. My garage and Rachel had received clear warnings about her behavior, but I should have known better than to expect Rachel to go quietly. That evening, while Mike's team was finishing up the security installation, Rachel emerged from her house with a new strategy. She had changed into what looked like a makeshift superhero costume, complete with a green cape and a new hand-painted sash reading "Eco Warrior Princess." "Attention neighborhood," she announced, standing in the middle of the shared driveway. "We are gathered here today to protest the militarization of green energy." The only people gathered were Dave, looking mortified, Barbara recording everything on her phone as usual, and a few curious neighbors who had stopped their evening walks to watch the spectacle. "Look at this," Rachel continued, gesturing dramatically at my garage. "Security cameras, restricted access, armed guards." "There are no armed guards, Rachel," I called out, trying to remain calm. "It's just basic security for private property." "That's what they want you to think," she declared. "This is just the beginning. Soon they'll be putting military-grade protection on all our environmental resources. Bird baths will require retinal scans. Solar panels will have anti-aircraft defenses." Dave finally stepped forward. "Rachel, honey, maybe we should go inside and—" "Not now, Dave, I'm saving the planet." She pulled out her phone and started live streaming. "This is Rachel Anderson, your eco-warrior princess, coming to you live from the front lines of the green energy war. Behind me, you can see the fortress they're building to keep the community from accessing clean power." Mike's team had paused their work to watch this performance, looking both amused and confused. One of them whispered to me, "Is she always like this?" Before I could answer, Rachel had moved on to her next act. She pulled out a stack of papers and started handing them to passing neighbors. "These are official notices of environmental protest. By signing these, you're joining the resistance against the privatization of Mother Nature." I asked one of the neighbors for a copy of the official notice. It was a bizarre document that seemed to be cobbled together from various environmental websites, with Rachel's own additions written in green glitter pen. The bottom had a space for signatures under the title "Warriors for Universal Resource Sharing, WRS." While Rachel was distracted with her protest, Mike approached me with updates on the security system. "We've installed motion-activated lights, high-resolution cameras with night vision, and a secure access panel with multi-factor authentication. The whole system is connected to your home security network and will send alerts to your phone." He showed me how to access the security footage through a new app, adjust the sensitivity of the motion sensors, and manage access codes. "We've also installed backup power supplies," he added. "Even if someone tries to cut the power, the security system will keep running." Rachel, overhearing this, spun around. "Backup power? That electricity belongs to the people. Dave, write this. Down! They're hoarding backup power now. Dave had finally reached his limit. No, Rachel, I'm not writing it down. This has gone too far. We need to talk. Talk? Talk? Rachel's voice rose an octave. While the planet dies, while they build their eco-fortress, while you get us evicted, Dave interrupted. The Hendersons weren't joking, Rachel. We have 48 hours to fix this. The Hendersons are part of the problem, Rachel declared. They're suppressing the environmental revolution. We need to get our own charging station. Dave's voice was firmer than I'd ever heard it. Like normal people, like Mark did. Rachel gasped as if Dave had personally betrayed her. You've been corrupted by their propaganda. Next, you'll be telling me we should pay for our own electricity. Yes, Dave exploded. That's exactly what I'm telling you. We should pay for our electricity like everyone else. Their argument continued as Mike's team finished up the installation. The new security setup was impressive. Professional-grade cameras covered every angle, motion sensors were strategically placed, and the reinforced garage door looked like it could withstand a small explosion. One more thing, Mike said, showing me a small device. We've installed electromagnetic sensors on the charging station itself. If anyone tries to tamper with it, even if they somehow get past everything, else this will trigger an immediate alert. Rachel, who had been arguing with Dave about the definition of theft versus resource redistribution, suddenly focused on our conversation. Electromagnetic sensors? That's radiation. You're poisoning the neighborhood with radiation. It's the same technology used in your Tesla's key fob, Mike pointed out. That's different, Rachel insisted. That's Dave. Explain why it's different. But Dave had walked away, heading toward their house while pulling out his phone. Through the open windows, I could hear him making a call. Hi, is this Mike's Electric? Yes, I'd like to schedule a consultation for a charging station installation. Rachel's eyes widened in horror. Dave, how dare you? You traitor! She ran inside, her green cape fluttering behind her. The next few hours were tense. Rachel's voice could be heard through the windows, alternating between berating Dave for his betrayal and making phone calls to various environmental organizations. Most seemed to hang up on her quickly, especially when she got to the part about her self-appointed position as eco-warrior princess. Meanwhile, Mike's team finished their work, and I spent some time learning the ins and outs of the new security system. The app was user-friendly, allowing me to monitor everything from my phone. I could even remotely disable the charging station if needed. But just when we thought everything was secure, Rachel came up with her most outrageous plan yet. Hit subscribe and the notification bell, because you won't believe what she tried to do during the Hendersons' inspection. And wait until you hear about Dave's final decision. The day of the Hendersons' inspection arrived, and with it came Rachel's final spectacular attempt to avoid responsibility. I woke up to find her staging what she called an eco-sit-in in front of my garage, complete with hand-painted signs reading "Free the electricity" and "Power to the people," literally. She had somehow convinced two confused college students to join her protest by promising them it was for a documentary about environmental justice. They quickly left when Barbara explained the actual situation, leaving Rachel alone with her signs and another new cape, this one decorated with glitter-glued lightning bolts. The real surprise came when Dave emerged from their house carrying several boxes to his car. "Rachel," he said firmly, "I'm not doing this anymore. I've rented a small apartment across town, and I've already scheduled the installation of my own charging station there." Rachel's protest signs dropped to the ground. "You're leaving me? For a charging station?" "No, Rachel. I'm leaving because you've lost touch with reality," Dave replied. The Hendersons arrive in an hour. I've already removed all the unauthorized electrical modifications from my side of the garage. The rest is up to you." As Dave drove away, Rachel's composure finally cracked. She ran inside, and for the next hour, we could hear her frantically moving things around in their garage. When the Hendersons arrived for their inspection, she met them with a completely new approach. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "I've had time to reflect on my actions, and I realize now that I may have been a bit overzealous in my environmental advocacy." The Hendersons exchanged skeptical looks, but followed her to the garage. Inside, they found that Rachel had indeed removed all her unauthorized electrical modifications by hiding them in the crawl space under the house. Unfortunately for her, she hadn't counted on Mrs. Henderson's thoroughness. "Miss Anderson," Mrs. Henderson said, shining a flashlight into the crawl space, "would you care to explain why there are extension cords and unauthorized electrical components under the house?" Rachel's fake smile faltered. "Those are historic artifacts from the previous tenant, part of the house's original green energy infrastructure." Mr. Henderson sighed. "Ms. Anderson, this is exactly why we included a clause about inspecting all areas of the property, including crawl spaces and attics." What followed was the most thorough property inspection I've ever witnessed. The Hendersons documented everything, from Rachel's hidden electrical modifications to the damage her eco-protests had caused to their property. By the end, they had enough evidence to justify immediate eviction. "You have 30 days to vacate the property," Mr. Henderson announced, "and we'll be deducting the cost of repairs from your security deposit." Rachel's response was unexpected. Instead of another outburst, she suddenly became very quiet. She walked to the middle of the driveway and sat down cross-legged, announcing, "I'm not leaving. I'm becoming one with the earth to protect it from environmental oppression." The Hendersons called the police, and Officer Martinez arrived, looking not at all surprised to be back. "Ms. Anderson," he said wearily, "we've been through this. You can't claim public property as a protest site, and you definitely can't claim private property." "I'm not claiming it," Rachel insisted. "I'm communing with it. The driveway and I are now spiritually connected." It took another hour, 3 police officers, and 1 very patient social worker to convince Rachel to return to her house. By then, Dave had returned with more boxes, methodically packing his belongings into his car. "Dave," Rachel called out, "tell them about our spiritual connection to the driveway." "Rachel," Dave replied, loading another box, "the only connection you have is to your own delusions. I've already paid the deposit on my new apartment, and I've hired a proper electrician to install a charging station there. It's over." Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood underwent a significant transformation. Dave moved out completely, leaving Rachel to pack up her own belongings. She made several more attempts to promote her environmental cause, including trying to organize a neighborhood charging station liberation front. No one joined. Attempting to declare my garage a historical site of environmental significance. The city clerk actually laughed. Starting a social media campaign called Free the Watts. It got 3 likes, all from her alternate accounts. Finally, on moving day, Rachel made her grand exit. She had decorated her Tesla with more environmental slogans and attached her various protest signs to the roof. As she drove away, her final act was to toss handfuls of glitter into the air, yelling, "You can't chain the lightning!" Barbara, who had documented everything, turned to me and said, "You know, in a weird way, I'm going to miss the entertainment." The Hendersons wasted no time in renovating the property. They hired Mike to install a proper charging station for future tenants, using my setup as a model. They also added specific clauses to their lease agreement about electrical modifications and unauthorized environmental committees. A month later, new neighbors moved in, a quiet couple who, ironically, also owned an electric car. The first thing they did was schedule a proper charging station installation with Mike. When I saw them carefully reviewing the installation plans and pulling proper permits, I knew things would be different this time. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned several valuable lessons. 1. Document everything. You never know when you'll need evidence. 2. Invest in proper security from the start. 3. Don't assume that someone's claimed cause, no matter how noble, justifies their actions. 4. Sometimes standing up for your rights means being painted as the villain. 5. A little patience and professionalism goes a long way. The neighborhood has returned to its peaceful state, though Barbara occasionally shares the videos she took of Rachel's various protests. They've become something of a legend in our local Facebook group, serving as a reminder that sometimes the loudest advocates for a cause can be its worst representatives. Dave, I heard, is doing well in his new apartment. He sent me a photo of his properly installed charging station with the caption, "Done right this time." I was glad to see he had learned from the experience too. As for Rachel, well, rumor has it she's now leading protests against wind farms, claiming they're stealing wind from the community. But that's a story for another day. If you enjoyed this crazy neighbor story, you won't want to miss these 2 videos. On the left, watch how my neighbor tried to claim my garden as a community food source. And on the right, see what happened when another entitled neighbor demanded access to my solar panels. Click on either video to keep the stories coming. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and notification bell to catch all my future neighbor stories. Trust me, there are plenty more where this came from. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.